According to a nationwide poll by the website 538, Vice President Kamala Harris does lead former President Donald Trump.
How deep was the hole that she had to climb out of?
I mean, I think it surprised people because there was these public polls that came out in late September, early October, showing us with leads that we never saw.
Richard Barris. Now, this is a guy who so many people wanted to say all year, Rich, they want to say that you're wrong, that you have no idea what's going on, that you're completely out of it, that you're making it up, you're a fraud, you're a nut job, you know, your polls are all over the place, and yet Poll Watch just came out last night. Poll Watch 2020 came out last night and said, drum roll please, folks, top pollster ranking for the 2020 National Popular Vote. Number 3, Atlas Intel. Number 2, Wall Street Journal. Number 1, Richard Barris, the Big Data Poll. Only off by 0.1%. A statistical anomaly is the only bit you got off. Rich, I don't understand. How can you get named the top pollster for the national poll when you're a complete fraud? Please explain this to me.
Do you know because I always laugh when I hear you said it all. Who's a fraud? He makes the numbers up. Do you have any idea how lucky somebody would have to be, the odds, to get as close as we got this year? And also in several of the key states in Pennsylvania, Jack, we were Trump 50.3, Harris 48. You know, in North Carolina, Trump 51.1, Harris 47.1. I mean, these are decimal points.
You got to, by the way, you got to send me those numbers. I want to put that all together to see what your final numbers were for each state as well. Because I mean,
that's right.
this
Florida,
we have had Rich on this program at least once a week the entire year round, and you told us from the start what was going on, and I remember even when the great, not to get super into it, but when the great Ann Seltzer put her poll out, I could hear Rich Barris in my ear, and I called you that night, and we had like a 40-minute conversation about response bias and all of these other issues, and then she goes on Mark Halperin the next morning, and she doesn't explain anything regarding response bias, or she's not weighting it based on people who just really want to take her polls or any of this. So, Rich, kudos to you, man. Congratulations. And just walk us through, though, a little bit about what makes Big Data Poll different from all of these mainstream polls. And we're going to talk about them in a second as well.
You know, one thing, and I think this is the foundation of it all, is that I was not born with a silver spoon in my mouth. My industry is dominated by elitists and wannabe elitists. They lean heavily left. And I know the people that I'm talking to, Jack. Like, I know the country. I know it's not that I've just traveled. I've been on both sides of the tracks. I guess, is the best way to state it. And I don't think anyone in my industry has stepped foot in a ghetto, right? Like an American ghetto. So how would you know what black men in barbershops were saying throughout urban areas around the country? You have to know not only people, but also historical, the historical nature and ethnicities of this country. And it's like, I would tell people this: how could you handicap, or how could you try to predict the outcome of the Super Bowl if you don't really know any of the players on either of the teams, right? You don't know anything about them. You don't know about what drives them, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses, what their interests are. You don't know anything about them. Maybe you know a little bit about the game, but how could you predict the behavior of people you don't understand? And then, that is the foundation of it all, because when you go to build out your methodology from there, you have to know when you see a response bias, and you have to be honest with yourself, whether it's one that, look, all pollsters have views, right? We pretend like we don't. You have to just cast that aside. Stop insulting the intelligence of the American public and the people who consume polls. They know you either lean right or you lean left. Stop pretending that you're a robot who's impartial in the middle. You're not. So your methodology has to guard against your own biases. This doesn't happen in this industry. It simply does not, unfortunately. And I wish it did. But some people, at best, we're subjected to that response bias. And I think is worse. I think she got a response bias, and she allowed her own bias to further inflate the result of that poll. She goes on Mark Halpern, and she's probably one of the worst examples of this. Her explanation, Jack, did not actually make sense to the criticisms of the poll. All right. This idea she found all these educated young women who came out for abortion. Abortion wasn't even the number one issue in her poll, Jack. Protecting democracy was.
I remember, Rich, you said that night, and you tweeted it, and you came on the show the next day and said it as well. You said, what, did she interview the entire line at the local Starbucks or something? This is not reflective of where people in the mood of the country are. It's just not reflective. And I remember hearing it as well. And I was saying, look, I'm not going to count out abortion completely, but the idea that was going to be the sole driving factor in a state like Iowa. And I remember we just kept saying, why is it then that they haven't deployed Tim Walz to Iowa when he's the governor of the next state? His state borders Iowa.
Right there.
Wouldn't he be there? He'd be camped there. It doesn't make any sense. It never did.
Especially since he supposedly had this regional working class blue collar appeal. Well, why isn't he down there getting it, right?
And I'm sure Politico is going to write articles about it, too. They're going to write about his connection with the worker class people and veterans and military members. And you can go and look at any of his actual election data, and you would see that that's not how he polls at all. He would get the big blue urban centers, and that's it. He's not connecting with, like, the Mike Lindell voter or the MyPillow employee in Shakopee, Minnesota. It's just not there.
Not even close. And this is something you and I actually talked about on your show when she chose him as the nominee. If you go and look at who these voters were who elected Shapiro versus those who elected Walz, Shapiro got nearly 20% of voters who backed Trump in 2020. I'm not saying they would have voted for Shapiro because of that. There are Republicans or Trumpers who do vote like that if they're not like Democrats. But Walz, very different, very typical, very left-wing Democratic map, relies on the Twin City burbs, relies on I wouldn't even say the word educated, the credentialed, professional, fanatical class that, votes on ideology in high numbers. He didn't connect with anyone in the Iron Range. He didn't connect with anyone in outside of Olmsted in the southeastern part of the state. He was a very typical, very generic Democratic appeal, and that's it. And I would just say this too, when it comes to that Iowa poll, again, I mean, this is a culmination of some bad behavior that we had seen from Seltzer going on now for a couple of years. I mean, Jack, I remember 2020 like it was yesterday, September, live polling on my show. It was never tied in the state of Iowa. And yet she had this race tied between Biden and Trump. And of course, Trump ran away with it. This time, far, far worse. Ladies and gentlemen, the last couple of weeks, I combined all of our responses from Iowa, whether we were doing the Rust Belt poll or the national poll, and barely weighting, Jack, just for simple gender, right? Very, very light weighting variables. And it was almost dead on to Trump's margin. It was almost identical. So I don't even believe that she got a response bias that dramatic here. I think she got a modest one, which she then created and turned into what she wanted. And this has got to stop with this industry. It's got to stop. Now, you know what? If they want to continue doing it, they can. Because it's just, bright days ahead for people like me.